For those of you who have come to know my channel, first off, thank you for your support. You guys are just so awesome and I couldn't be more appreciative. And second, you've probably come to expect from my channel that I look at games as literature. And while I will be doing that today, I regrettably won't be making a larger argument about the significance of the game's literary value because, well, I can't. Because Castlevania Lords of Shadow was our best bet at getting what video games are already phenomenal at doing, telling the story of an epic. But by stepping on their own narrative, characters, and most unfortunately, their brilliant merger of mechanics and story, Konami dropped the ball on this one. So no need to summon your muse because this is Sole Porpoise and I'm here to tell you how Konami snatched defeat from the jaws of victory and ruined what could have been the defining video game epic. Let's begin at the logical place, the introduction, because this game was groundbreaking in its opening moments. While other epics have made it clear that they were epics, Castlevania wasn't so blatant, and that's solely due to how subtle it was in presenting its themes and the story it was paying homage to, Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. Because in Dante's account, not only is the main character attempting to make contact with his recently deceased love, but hope and redemption are substantial themes as well. The message of Dante's Inferno isn't all that impressive by today's standards given that we have different value systems than those that existed 700 years ago. But the gist was this. Dante is traveling to heaven to reach his recently deceased beloved, Beatrice. At the opening of the story, he walks towards the sun that shines at the top of a mountain. Dante understands this to be a holy light and therefore his guide to heaven. When he attempts to climb it, he is derailed by three beasts and discovers that he must make his way through hell and purgatory before he can traverse heaven. When he reaches hell, he finds the words "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here" written on the gates. And it's because Dante is alive, he doesn't have to play by the same rules as those who have died before him, and have to endure the torture that he relays to the reader. As brutal as this description sounds, there's still this notion that avoiding eternal suffering requires a change in the way one lives their life. And everyone who's reading enjoys the same hope that they can change their fate. This idea of redemption is exactly what Castlevania talks about.
Murderer. Beyond redemption? Beyond hope.
And Castlevania doesn't stop there. There's also the fact that the sun is behind Gabriel at his back as we see him traveling. Additionally, the villagers are not walking in the same direction as Gabriel, they're walking against him, towards the light. Finally, the narrator conflates light with hope in his opening speech.
These are dark times. Times without hope.
This all adds up to using light in the same way that Dante used light in his poem, as a metaphor for holiness. Because Gabriel, just like Dante, must walk away from the light in order to reach his destination. And because Castlevania is loyal to this visual metaphor, we now see that there is something holy about this direction, and something less holy about this direction. So it's no wonder that light and darkness is a massive theme in Castlevania. So massive, we find our first example of how they merge mechanics with narrative by making the light and darkness part of your powers, your light and shadow magic. And that's not to mention how loyal this game is to the literary criteria that makes epics what they are. Starting with the fact that they have us join Gabriel in medias res, that is, in the middle of his story, because he's already on the quest to speak with his dead wife as per the Brotherhood and his plan. But the reason that this matters isn't only because it's part of the criteria for poetic epics, it matters because this kind of fast pace is exactly why video games lend themselves to be such good candidates for telling the story of an epic. And Castlevania takes advantage of itself as an, albeit coincidental, but ideal storytelling medium. It does it in the same way most video game epics do, by making the hero's weapon merge with the story. In poetic epics, part of what makes an epic is that the hero character is in some way guided by the gods or at the very least given some kind of divine favor or privilege. And the clever way that video games have learned to include this in narrative is through the hero's weapon. We see it in God of War where Kratos is given the Blades of Chaos from the God of War Ares, which enables him to accomplish superhuman feats. And God of War really seems to play with this idea, because they could have had Kratos use the Blades of Chaos to defeat Ares, ironically killing him with his own weapon, but they passed up on that idea by having Ares take the Blades of Chaos away from Kratos. We then find that the hulking sword bridge that's part of the environment was, in the words of the narrator, a gift from the gods, brilliantly integrating this epic narrative that the hero is chosen by the gods into the gameplay. Castlevania doesn't come up short here either. One of the first things that you'll notice about Gabriel's weapon, the combat cross, is that it resembles the symbol for Christianity, the cross. Then of course, there is the lore behind the combat cross that explains it was made by Ronaldo Gandolfi and for the high-ranking members of the Brotherhood of Light who are the knights dedicated to serving God. And it's through this weapon that's crafted for holy purposes that enables Gabriel to have superhuman abilities. This idea that Gabriel has holy strength is even in his name, where the Hebrew Gavriel translates to the strength of God. So with Gabriel's might being linked to God, the mechanics are showy, gratuitous, and, well, justified. And on the subject of God, Castlevania integrates the Christian lore with the lore from the world that they created really well. And this is what epics provide: plot-heavy, mysterious worlds that have living, breathing backgrounds. Because while other gods existing at the same time as the Christian God seems contradictory to the monotheistic religion, it actually isn't. There's evidence that the ancient readings of the Old Testament and some interpretations of the New Testament actually show that the old versions of Judaism and Christianity are not monotheistic, but polytheistic. Or more accurately, henotheistic, that is, the belief that other gods exist, but there should only be the worship of the one single God. In this case, Elohim, Yahweh, or as the kids call him, God with an uppercase G. So while it might seem like Castlevania is all over the place by introducing other gods into a story where the well-known Elohim already exists, it's not as contradictory as you might initially think. This is done in the same way that Dante integrates the divine characters from other myths and religions into the Inferno. Divine characters like Ephialtes, Phlegus, and Plutus. And so Castlevania's introduction of Pan, a representation of the goat-like Greek god of nature, is certainly consistent with the scope of the other epics, and Castlevania just does this really nicely. They refer to Pan as one of the old gods, suggesting that he's become more and more irrelevant. By doing so, it foreshadows one of the more emotional parts of the game, the moment where you have to kill Pan. Now, I don't know how common it was for players to get attached to Pan. There is nothing that leaps out that makes Pan a lovable character, but that's kind of why I liked him. He was never just a tool for exposition. He very clearly had his own goals, but he never made it clear what they were. I was unaware of his intentions for a long time, and I felt like I was on guard around him. But his consistent aid eroded that initial suspicion, and I began to bat it away whenever it resurfaced. So when I had to fight him, there was no question I was reluctant. But I had no choice, and not just because it's what the game demanded for my progression. There's something noteworthy about the fact that my lack of choice was partly dictated by the narrative. I wasn't confronted with the ultimatum to fight or be trapped in the game space. There was a sense of urgency that came with this fight that demanded I fight or die. And that's part of what made it so painful and confusing for me, and Gabriel as well.
Why? Why did you make me fight you?
Because this is how it must be. We must all make sacrifices in order to find redemption.
No, I did not want this. I did not ask for this.
Blood must be spilt for this path to be opened to you. I accept my fate. Can you accept yours?
As we find out, we had to kill him for the prophecy to be fulfilled. We empathize with Pan because we know that we're as much of a tool as he is. This is the epitome of what a game should do. They should make you feel how the main character feels, and yet again, Castlevania is successful, because I felt betrayed by the prophecy. What's more, the game doesn't just present this as a generic fight, it's a way to train you for the fight with Satan so you don't have the feeling that Pan's death was in vain by the end of the game. Because his death transcends beyond just a justification for advancing the narrative. Pan had to die not to train Gabriel, but you, the player. And then, Pan bleeds his silver ichor onto the battleground and literally opens the Valley of Death for Gabriel. With all of that said, there were moments like this one where I was thinking, what's going on? This game is a perfect 10. Were the reviewers wrong, or am I just so satisfied with my analysis of games that I'm deluding myself into loving them more than they deserve? But hang on, because before you respond to that and hurt my feelings, we can definitely say the reviewers were right. This game is a solid 7. Because as brilliant as this merger of mechanics and narrative is, Konami quite simply dropped the ball. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this, and I don't want to pile on with what was already said. Sure, the platforming was as awkward as Sarah Palin when her teleprompter cuts out.
So we can afford no retreads, or nothing will change. That's status quo. And GOP leaders, by the way, the man.
But I think one of the real weaknesses of this game is its story. The way it's delivered is just a mess. It starts at the point that I think all of us who played the game started to feel a little bit less confident about it. The fight with the Ice Titan. Now, it's worth mentioning this fight could have been a great experience. The setting, as is consistent with the homage to Dante's Inferno, is a retelling of Dante's confrontation with Satan. Okay, let me rephrase, Dante's interpretation of Satan. In the poem, Satan is trapped at the waist, frozen in a lake of ice. And Dante advances past Satan by climbing on him. Again, this is a brilliant marriage of mechanics and narrative because both the homage and the combat maintain their integrity. Neither feels like they sacrificed their merits so the other could be shoehorned in. And for this reason, it works. It works, except for the fact that you have no idea that this fight is significant other than the fact that the boss has a life meter. You don't understand the Ice Titan's role or significance until about an hour later when Claudia explains to you what the Titans are and their role in the world.
The Titans outlived their creators and stayed here fighting against an enemy that outnumbered them until even they were defeated. All except one. Behind those doors awaits the last of those Titans.
Wait, how could she know this is the last Titan? I defeated the Ice Titan long before I met her. As far as she knows, that Titan is still alive. Maybe she came to understand this by reading Gabriel's thoughts? But if so, that was never communicated to me. Now this raises the question, was the Ice Titan one of the Titans she's talking about? And after asking all of these questions, I realize most of my confusion comes from the fact that I'm stumped as to why they would introduce lore about a boss after I've killed literally half of their kind. Oh wait, I don't even know that I killed half of their kind, because if we're judging this by rules of the fight, the Dracolich, who I fight at the end of the game, felt alarmingly similar to the fights with the Titans, since they're the only 3 enemies that have this glyph system that was ripped off of Shadow of the Colossus. Yet Claudia just told me information that would refute this idea.
Behind those doors awaits the last of those Titans.
This kind of confusion is one of the deadly sins of storytelling. It's not just a plot hole, it's a contradiction that leaves the audience with an ambiguous interpretation of the story. Tragically, an ambiguous plotline is what destroys Castlevania. Not only is there confusion about the timelines, but it offers ambiguous characters as well. One of the weirdest examples of this is in the confrontation with the Necromancer, who looks like the personification of death and talks like the personification of death.
Look upon me, hypocrite! Gaze upon glorious death!
But actually isn't death. So when he begins this potentially interesting conversation by calling Gabriel a murderer and demands that Gabriel has no right to judge him, I'm confused. Because I don't know who he is, much less if I should judge him. This is like if you met someone who told you they were in a movie and had a single line of, "Telephone call for you, sir," and then followed it up with, "But I like my privacy, so please, no pictures." You'd probably be confused. But instead of taking the time to correct that and say, "Well, I don't care," you just say, "Okay," and move on. This is what I did with the Necromancer. But I still have to give it to them. This theme that Gabriel is as bad as the monsters in this world and it's all due to the prophecy that he has to abide by is a really interesting idea. But before you can allow that to resonate in your brain, he goes ahead and transforms into Skull Greymon for no goddamn reason. And this brings us to the end of the game, where we meet Zobek, who reveals in the longest speech I've seen since Rand Paul's Snickers filibuster that he betrays us with a gauntlet. Somehow. And Gabriel was the one who actually killed Marie, I guess? Then he assaults you with more rapid-fire plot twists. And oh my god, he's still talking. I get the feeling that when Konami contracted Patrick Stewart for Zobek, they paid him by the word and got the 15,000 word package in advance. And then, by the end of the game, they realized that they had 4,000 words still left over and decided to get their money's worth. So when he's finally finished, Gabriel dies, and you find out that Satan was the real mastermind of Zobek's plan. Then, Marie brings you back to life, again, somehow. And while that's happening, I feel it's necessary to point out that we again see this really interesting idea that Zobek used the prophecy against Gabriel, transforming him from a prophet into a pawn. This is a fascinating idea, and the thing I regret doing most, killing Pan, was dictated by the prophecy, which causes me to question the ethics of the divine. And because Zobek was able to manipulate the prophecy, now I'm questioning the omnipotence of the divine. But sadly, this isn't what leaps out, because Castlevania spends no more time than was already spent allowing you to feel contrition for murdering Pan. Instead, they target Marie and Claudia, and unfortunately, this does nothing for me emotionally. In fact, it adds confusion, because just as Gabriel watches him murder them both in his dreams, and then feels released from any tension when he wakes up, I too was divorced from any tension, and therefore my emotion. And that's because I didn't kill Marie or Claudia. A cutscene did. Now, finally, we're ready to fight Satan. And luckily, his speech doesn't last that long. And in it, he says something that's almost inspired, it's so good.
You monkeys don't deserve redemption. It is my divine right to rule by his side as an equal.
Yes, finally. I have to hand it to Konami this time because they at least got Satan's character right. The most interesting of stories behind Satan are based on the fact that he wants God's love, and he respects his role, but he has the very relatable position that he does not want to be subjugated. Through that story, there is a tragedy behind Satan's character, because he was created as an angel, and therefore he's bound to the servitude of God for eternity, yet he has more free will than his role allows. So when he says he wants to be an equal to God, this is exactly the Satan character we want to see. He doesn't say anything ridiculous like he wants anything more than that.
Or perhaps more than that.
I hate it. I'm out.
And with this, I'm about as disappointed with Castlevania as my dad was with me when he saw me swing a baseball bat. Because this is another reason Konami dropped the ball. Less is more. There was no reason to suggest that Satan is just after power, other than to make his character more flat, predictable, and stereotypical villain. So, I never knew it was possible, but from this, I learned an entire character can be ruined with nothing more than an M-dash. So, Satan's character is hopeless, but what about God's character? We don't know much about him other than that the earth has been separated from him. Well, unfortunately, from the game that talks about a balance between light and dark,
Some call this eternal struggle equilibrium, the balance between light and darkness.
we don't get to know much more about God other than a couple of sentences about how the characters interpret God.
I was adored once above all others. I too didn't deserve to be cast out, abandoned. Now you know what that feels like, don't you? Hate can bring us back, give us strength, embrace it.
It is what is in men's hearts that he cares about. He loves you as he loves me. We have only to ask for forgiveness deep within ourselves and be welcomed back. Every man has the power to repent. I have faith in that.
Now look, I know what you're thinking. Gabriel, stop choking out Satan. You're not a New York City cop. Yeah, sure, that too. But you're also thinking this characterization of God is, well, useless. It does nothing to establish God's character. It simply serves as a vague statement that a lot of people probably agree with in the God that they worship. But let's look at God as the literary character in the Bible. To say that he's forgiving of anyone who asks is just wrong. God is a smiter. It's kind of his thing. He destroys cities for having too much kinky sex, and he floods the entire planet because he wants a do-over. So to say that God is forgiving of whoever asks, including Satan, it's not just wrong, it's not even descriptive. In contrast to all of this, the ending isn't entirely a lost cause, because this confusing narrative is coupled with another shining example of a fight that does what Castlevania does best, merges mechanics with narrative. Satan interrupts the battle by putting up barriers that prohibit you from passing unless you're using the corresponding light or shadow magic. The first time I tried this, I admit, made me fumble with my controller until I realized it wasn't that hard to just switch back and forth. It's easy enough. But the second time he does this, the barriers are now independent circles that move even across each other, causing my brain to say,
I hate it, I'm out.
In this moment, I remember thinking, that's impossible. And with that came a sense of despair. And maybe it's just because this game has been so good about carrying the themes of Dante's Inferno that this feeling of self-doubt reminds me of the poem. Because there are times where Dante describes this kind of doubt in himself. And just as quickly as he communicates it, he's admonished by his friend Virgil, who says that he should know better since the divine are watching over Dante. And after my feeling of doubt, I realized that because God was still separated from the earth, I had to solve this and defeat Satan. Because while victory seemed like it was within arm's reach, it wasn't something for me to brute force into submission. and it wasn't something that could be outsmarted and manipulated. I was charged with one last trial in my gauntlet of many, and my task wasn't to have faith in God like Dante, but to have faith in my mastery of the mechanics. So while I've beaten up on Castlevania Lords of Shadow, probably to the distaste of many of you, I hope that it's clear that I'm not doing so for sport. I'm just disappointed with it. The peaks in this game were so high, but the valleys were too low and too long. There was a real opportunity here for Konami to capitalize on all of their brilliant mergers of mechanics and narrative. But instead of creating a cogent story, from my perspective, they didn't. This was a confusing and convoluted story. A story that entered the black hole of storytelling. One that lacks any perspective. Instead of taking their inspirations and making them into something new, they just kind of used them and forgot about them, leading me to believe that their inspirations didn't inspire them, but instead eased their creative burden. And from that, we're left with a lot of loose ends. Why did they bother referencing Dante's Inferno? What was the point? Should I question the ethics of the divine, since the prophecy forces Gabriel to do what God asked of him, but he ends up being punished for it? Do Gabriel and Satan have similar backstories, and if so, why does this matter? Unfortunately for Castlevania, they lost focus of the fact that they were telling us a story through an epic, because epics provide us with a channel through which to empathize with the main character, since we understand the same cultural myths and have the same biblical grounding. And it's through this the audience should be discovering new things about the divine worlds and the divine characters we yearn to better understand. But instead, Castlevania offered contradictory lore in a confusing world, and it castrated its divine characters, turning them into nothing more than banal representations of good and evil. So while Castlevania leaves us with questions, these questions don't have answers, and all the audience is left with is the toxic residue of ambiguity. That's how gamers lost out on what could have been the iconic video game epic. Castlevania borrowed from the greats and remained average. So unfortunately, we're left with one last question, to ask why. Why did Konami overlook the emotional value that's created from their merger of mechanics and narrative, and instead choose to run with making an already confusing story more confusing by adding in plot holes and contradictions? And to this question, I suspect we all have the same answer. It's to throw up our hands in frustration and exclaim, God only knows. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more analyses of games as literature, make sure to like and subscribe because I have a whole lot more on the way just waiting to be delivered to your subscription feed. And have I mentioned that I made a video analyzing the Mass Effect trilogy? Definitely check that out. It's been praised as, this video has put the Mass Effect trilogy in a whole new light for me. You made me love the Mass Effect series even more, great video, and TBH, some parts do seem like grasping at straws, smiley face. So make sure to click here now to see it because time's running out.